think the story starts with Manigo, right? Principal founder, he's our main guy. And on December 6th, he invites Ray, his good friend, and a new friend, Horace Spangler Weiser, a young man from York, Pennsylvania, the fourth of 14 children, father's a merchant and an attorney. And Horace is a little resistant early on. He's not really interested in this sort of thing. He doesn't have that prep school background that the other two do. And Manigo begins to tell them about his reasons for wanting a new organization. He's done some research in the classics department. He's picked out some letters and some names. And they start to sort of put this together. What might it look like? Saturday, December 6th, 1845. Of course, we mark that as the founding date of the organization, when the first three founders come together. Manigo becomes the principal founder, though, right? This is his idea, and he begins to water that seed over the next several months. He designs rituals, he picks out values, he solidifies the name, decides on the closed motto, the secret motto of the organization. And then the three of them really start an intense recruiting effort. So from December of 1845 through June of 1846, when the first class is announced, they start recruiting friends. So to their trio, they add 14 more. So June 24th, 1846 is what Louis would have considered the founding date for Alpha Sigma Phi. They announce a new sophomore society at Yale, finally a rival to Kappa Sigma Theta, the lone sophomore society. 17 members strong, and some pretty impressive names on the list. A fun part of that story is shortly thereafter we get our first legacy. That's Weiser's brother, Erasmus. What a name. Erasmus Weiser is our first legacy in the fall of 1846, so he joins the 17 at that point. What becomes apparent for the new Alpha Sigma Phi is that they need a way to get their message out. Kappa Sigma Theta, the lone sophomore society to this point, sort of owns the communication mouthpiece of the sophomore class. Each class got its own newspaper. As the only sophomore society, Kappa Sigma Theta owned that, and it became apparent very quickly that Alpha Sigma Phi would benefit from something similar.
You know, I think the Tomahawk has this incredible place in the life of Alpha Sigma Phi, and today stands as the oldest fraternal publication in the United States. And I think that's very special. It really was born as almost a protest.
It does a lot of editorializing. There's some art, some poetry, some song, but the main purpose is really to attack Kappa Sigma Theta in a way that we couldn't in public. Remember, this is long before a Facebook or a social media. If you wanted to tell the world what you were about, a newspaper was a pretty good way to do it in 1847. Eventually, the satire and the aggressive nature of the publication catches up to it. In 1852, the faculty decides they finally had enough of the Tomahawk, and it's suppressed. So it was really only in existence for those 5 years. There aren't volumes prior to the second founding of the Tomahawk, just a few student newspapers. So 6 cents would get you the news of the day and some pretty exciting editorial satire, as it were.
But most importantly, I think the Tomahawk functions as that historical record for Alpha Sigma Phi. Like any printed publication of that sort, it's telling a story that can only be told with the printed word. And we're telling stories today about our members, both undergraduate and alumni members, and we're telling stories about how we're impacting the society at large and how Alpha Sigma Phi does play a role in people's lives. That mission to me is paramount, and there are things that happen with the Tomahawk that are almost inexplicable. I know that for many alumni, it is the one point of contact that they have with Alpha Sigma Phi. And if we did not send out that magazine to folks, they would miss, you know, that particular contact. As a result, we've had surprise gifts come into the fraternity where we didn't even know that an alumnus was interested in bequesting dollars to Alpha Sigma Phi and to our mission, but yet they kept in touch with the fraternity through the Tomahawk. Not even with their own chapters sometimes that they have much contact, but they did through the Tomahawk with the national organization, and then upon their passing decided they wanted to leave some money to support the mission of our fraternity. That's the power of a magazine like the Tomahawk. And I can tell you that being the editor for the Tomahawk for so many years, it's one of the greatest privileges I've ever had. It's a true honor to be able to touch that publication and know that we are keeping thousands of men connected. So Evan Varner, I came to see him as this incredible volunteer, as an incredible workhorse, a man who was tireless in his efforts for Alpha Sigma Phi. He, of course, continued his full-time employment, and he then worked on the publications of Alpha Sigma Phi, writing handbooks and newsletters and editing the Tomahawk and doing all kinds of things that helped codify what the organization was doing and needed to do in the 1970s and into the 1980s. I had the opportunity to actually stay in his home when he had moved to Washington, D.C. As I left the fraternity staff and went to Washington looking for work, and Evan put me up and put up with me for several months as I was looking for employment and helped me get on my feet. And what I noticed about Evan is he would get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. He would run off to work. He would come home sometimes 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night after working all day, and he would have a quick bite to eat and run into his office and start working on the Tomahawk or start working on a publication for Alpha Sigma Phi. And he would do that until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and then he would get up and do it all over again. And this was a daily occurrence. It was not just, on occasion. He influenced lots of people in Alpha Sigma Phi, serving on the Grand Council, and then of course becoming Grand Senior President before he passed into the Omega chapter. But he stands large in this organization, he really does. And following in his footsteps, not only as editor of the Tomahawk, but on the Grand Council, I can tell you I've had him whisper in my ear a number of times, giving me advice and keeping me straight and helping me out.
After the first couple of years, right, we've got a newspaper, we've formed ourselves, we know how to recruit. Things get a little more interesting in the 1850s as we expand beyond Yale. Some of that early growth to other Ivy League institutions is a bit of a struggle for the organization. Out and back a couple times on those things. It gets a little more interesting when we get to 1860, the start of the Civil War, really on the eve of the war. Delta chapter at Marietta College in Ohio was founded, part of the old Northwest Territory, east side of Ohio, a little closer to Yale. Delta assembles a group of 9 men. They petition Alpha Sigma Phi for a charter. This will be the 4th group that Alpha Sigma Phi has chartered, and they approve them as Delta. So Delta's installed in 1860. Shortly thereafter, war breaks out, right? This is the beginning of the American Civil War. 8 of the 9 founders of Delta leave the university and go off to join the Ohio Infantry, fight for the North in the Civil War. They leave 1 man behind, that's Lyman Strong, who is a charter member of Delta. Lyman is instrumental in starting Epsilon chapter at Ohio Wesleyan University in 1863. An interesting part of the Delta story is that when those 8 go away, 2 of their first HSPs, their presidents, go with them. That's Whittlesley and Turner. Both die in the war. They're given campus funerals. The only funeral to take place at Marietta College is these 2 officers. They both wield their swords, their cavalry sabers, to the Marietta chapter, and those are used really until the 1990s as the swords. During the war, we also have a problem at Yale. The faculty finally suppresses Alpha Sigma Phi and says we've had enough of the rivalry here, and we've had enough of this behavior. The men at Yale at the time weren't going to go quietly. They wanted that sophomore link. At this point, Kappa Sigma Theta had died by the 1860s. So Yale transitions. They form a new society, which is Delta Beta Xi. So from 1864 to 1876, men pledged their allegiance to Alpha Sigma Phi under the name Delta Beta Xi at Yale. This really leaves Delta alone starting in 1864. Ohio Wesleyan has a short run. The war ends in 1865, and Delta finds itself without a mother chapter. That had been their operating model, right? Alpha's down. And they carry on, not really realizing that Delta Beta Xi is Alpha Sigma Phi sub rosa, from 1864 all the way to the second founding. And that's a really long period for a local chapter to go on by itself. About 1880, they start to receive some overtures from other national organizations who are interested in acquiring a strong chapter at a strong university in what was the Northwest at the time. So they're approached by several other national organizations. Cincinnati is the major hub. If you graduate from Marietta, you probably end up in Cincinnati, right down the river. So the alumni in Cincinnati start to get word of Delta, this lone chapter, being courted by other fraternities, and they're not excited about the idea that Alpha Sigma Phi may go away completely. So in 1880, they organize the first Sig Bust. They actually get the university president to release all 21 undergraduate members of Alpha Sigma Phi. They travel by steamboat down the Ohio River to Cincinnati. They're met at the port by a brother in a suit of armor who escorts them to banquets, and they spend almost a week banqueting and singing and speeching and just having a great time. Alumni from Yale, Amherst, and Marietta are all present there, and they call the event a bust. They want to have kind of a blowout. So this is the first Sig Bust, which happens in 1880. To honor the service of those alumni who helped organize the bust, Delta creates the concept of an alumni chapter and presents a charter to the Cincinnati alumni chapter. That's really the first organized alumni situation in Alpha Sigma Phi as a result of that first Sig Bust. So alumni have always been an important part of the organization, and every time we've struggled, the alumni have stepped forward to support and hold up the fraternity, and that happens again at the end of the 30s. So in 1938, as the organization's governing structure is recrafted, we go to Grand Council for the first time. There's a couple important things that happen. We need to find a way to recognize the alumni contribution to the organization. About that time, Musgrave in his work, now as historian, had been trying to pinpoint the role of Delta Beta Xi in our history. And by about 1920, he's convinced that the Delta Beta Xi initiates from 64 to 75 are members of Alpha Sigma Phi. He can't quite prove it. That changes for him in about 1920 when he is asked to meet with the university president, a man named Hadley. And Hadley meets him and crosses the foyer in their meeting room, gives him the grip of Alpha Sigma Phi, whispers the secret motto into his ear, and lets him know that he was a member of Delta Beta Xi, and that Hadley's belief as the Yale president of the university, is that Delta Beta Xi is the legitimate successor. And that really clinches it for Musgrave. Fast forward to the 1930s, we're trying to find a way to recognize the alumni contribution, right, in this sort of selfless way, the volunteers who give of their time, talent, and treasure to make Alpha Sigma Phi great, asking nothing in return. The best way the Grand Council can think of is to name an award after the men who did some of that same work at Yale, and that's Delta Beta Xi. Frank Hargier is the Grand Marshal at the time, a member of the Grand Council. This is Hargier's conception that we would have this national award to honor alumni contributions to the organization. That first year they name 100 SIGs to the first class of Delta Beta Xi men. Delta Beta Xi has a key that looks like the membership badge used at Yale during that time, and is really a seminal honor for an alumnus recognizing significant contributions. And it was Hargier and that Grand Council that formed that in 1938. I think that brings us up to the turn of the century, right? Where the Sig bust is behind us, the chapter is saved in 1880. They don't excel. By 1900, the chapter has ebbed a bit. They have one undergraduate member as the century turns. Again, alumni from Cincinnati intercede. They recruit 7 additional men in the fall of 1900, so they start 1901 with a group of 8. And they're okay for a while, right? It's hard to be a lone group at Marietta College. About 1907, it's December now, we're through the fall semester, and a group of friends get together at Yale. There are 4 of them, Robert Irvin, who's a gentleman from Ohio, and that's an important part of our story, Ben Crenshaw, Arthur Eli, and a familiar name, Edwin Waterbury. And they're in the Yale Masonic Club together. They're Masons, they're playing cards, it's December, the semester has ended, and a very similar conversation as happened, I think, in 1845 happens around the Yale society system, its shortcomings and benefits. Waterbury says that he's been in the library as part of his final exams and happened to stumble upon some old records. There was a group that was part of a sophomore society. It was very strong for a while. And he thought they had a chapter still in Ohio, and Irvin's ears perk up. And he remembers that he's heard this name before. Alpha Sigma Phi is not a new name for him. Being an Ohio man, he knows some of the alumni of this Marietta College chapter and wonders if they're still around. So the group talk more and more. They add a few more members. Wayne Musgrave joins the group, who is a graduate student. Musgrave is quite accomplished already, has a law degree, is at Yale to extend his law studies, has been the principal of a high school before. Not a young man, not an inexperienced man. To that, they also add Frederick Waldron, and those 6 become the second founders. Irvin uses his Marietta connection to these alumni, writes a letter to his Ohio friends and asks if there's still a chapter at Marietta College. And 2 things happen simultaneously at this point. When the alumni of Delta receive that information, the very first thing they do is dispatch one of their alumni to check out this group at Yale, right? Who are these 6 men? Where did they come from? How do they know about us? Maybe a little suspicious. So there's a brother who's got a pastorate in Connecticut. He's filling a pastorate there. He travels over and asks to meet the group. Of course, Musgrave, Waterbury, and friends meet him. And he reports back to the alumni. These seem to be fine, upstanding young men, would make a good addition if they're interested. The second thing that happens is that a veil of secrecy is put around Delta, right? Because the chapter is not strong. At the time, there are about 7 men there. So the alumni really want to keep that quiet. They want this group to come from New Haven and charter and receive a charter and go back and help make a national fraternity. They've got some ideas. And this is going to be a way to end the lone Delta situation and to start to rebuild the national fraternity. They didn't really know what they were in for at that point in 1907. So this is fun in that Musgrave, because he's a little older and has a bit of a historian bend, is keeping journals and notes. So we have a lot of contemporaneous documentation, right? We know what happened. So the 6 of them board a train. Now they're college students, so they're gonna take the cheapest form possible, but they need to get there quickly. So they decide to ride in the car immediately behind the engine. And in coal-fired trains, which is what they're riding, the car right behind the engine is basically like riding in the exhaust pipe. So they arrive in Marietta in the middle of the night. And it's a little confusing. There are a lot of people there to meet them. It's night, they're far away from home, they've had a very long ride, and they get separated. And Irvin, the gentleman from Ohio who wrote the letter asking to be there, gets separated and they don't find him for the weekend. So the 5 of them now, right, with Irvin peeled off, the 5 of them spend March 27th, 1907 into the evening, the wee hours of March 28th, 1907, being initiated. So for the first time, Delta has now restored the charter to Alpha. They spend the next 2 days getting to understand how to run a fraternity. How does this work? They learn about the ritual, they learn about chapter operations, and they talk a little bit with the Delta undergraduates about what the dream is. What are we going to do? There are now, at that point, 12 of them, soon to be 13, initiated undergraduates at our second founding in 1907. They go back to Yale, ride the train back, and when they get there, their first order of business, of course, is using their newly practiced initiation skills to initiate Brother Irvin, who had been lost. So now the 6 of them begin to form the genesis of the national organization. From 1907, when the second founding occurs, we move forward in time, and really there are a couple driving forces in the fraternity. Of the six, the two most important, the ones that we remember, are Edwin Waterbury and Wayne Musgrave. And even within them, there's a bit of an imbalance there. Waterbury becomes our communications director, right? He's our first corresponding secretary. That's the role he's going to play in the new chapter. He's an early delegate to the first convention in 1907. He goes back to Marietta again. But it's really Musgrave who becomes the driving force behind the idea of the national fraternity. And again, he's a little older, a little more experienced, really an accomplished student. So he finishes his studies at Yale, adds another Juris Doctorate to his degree. Pyle moves to Harvard and receives another degree from Harvard. And as he moves, he begins chartering groups for Alpha Sigma Phi through the Ivy League, right? So not only is Yale back thanks to him, here comes Harvard back as Beta. When he arrives, he moves and does some work at Columbia later. That's Lambda, chartered again. And Musgrave, because of the way they organized the national fraternity, which had never had a governing organization before, Musgrave puts himself in the Grand Junior President position. It's decided that the Grand Senior President should be a man of national renown. So the first ones are governors, congressmen, university presidents. It's almost funny to think today that a person of that stature would have time to do something like this, but that was quite an honor then. So Musgrave puts himself as the operator. He's really going to form the chief executive officership of the organization and drive it forward. And that starts in 07 and it ends in 23. So for a period of 16 years there, he drives us on. I want to just talk for a minute about the first Grand Senior President, because he's an interesting guy. This is A.D. Follett. He's a Marietta alum. And he really gave us the idea of the old gal. Follett gives a speech in the 1920s, trying to describe his vision for the organization, right? What it would be. And the metaphor that he uses is that of a statue. He refers to the statue in the feminine always, and he really carves the statue with his words and tries to give symbolic meaning to each feature of this female statue that he's carving. And when he gets done, he refers to the statue, right, as a metaphor for the fraternity as the old gal, and tells the gathered alumni that they should think back fondly on the old gal as they go forward. That speech is published in the Tomahawk, which Waterbury's editing by then, and really becomes the way that we come to think of the fraternity in the feminine, and begin to refer to her as the old gal. So we can pinpoint that moment and that person. A.D. Follett is the one who originated the idea that Alpha Sigma Phi would be the old gal, and that really caught with a generation of SIGs, and we carried that forward into the future. Second founding, 1907. Immediately after that comes a lot of interest. This is the progressive era in America. New century, new optimism, new opportunities, lots of new institutions that started after the Civil War that have started to come into their own. And Alpha Sigma Phi takes advantage of that momentum. So after the second founding, we open groups Zeta, Eta, and Theta. That's Ohio State, Illinois, and Michigan, prominent land-grant institutions in the old Northwest Territory. The drive westward continues. Musgrave continues to populate the Ivy League for us on the East Coast. In 1912, we finally reach the West with Mu, solidified with Nu right after that. Psi at Oregon State comes a little later. So very quickly, we've spread coast to coast by about 1920. The 20s are a great time for American fraternities, and Alpha Sigma Phi is no different. We ride that wave of expansion. This is a petitioning system, so groups of formed undergraduate men will petition Alpha Sigs. In the organizational structure of the day, every chapter got to vote on those petitions. It was Musgrave's job as the Grand Senior President to circulate them, to ask existing chapters to admit new groups. And that's when a bit of a rift starts between Musgrave, and really it becomes a bit of a battle between the New York-based alumni and undergraduate chapters in New England, and the middle of the country, really based out of Chicago, which we consider the West, right, at the time. And that rivalry lasts through the 1920s. We hire our first executive secretary, our first true staff member. That's Charles Hall. He comes from Columbia, and he and Musgrave are a bit of oil and water. from 1920 when he's hired until 23 when Musgrave finally retires as Grand Junior President. That struggle is finally put to rest when Musgrave retires. Hall moves out of the executive secretary role, and we get men from the West. Charles Mitchell from Nebraska is the next man in that chief executive seat, and we get a member of Theta chapter, Ben Crenshaw, who becomes the Grand Junior President for a while. So the 30s then, as we come up to the sort of the doorstep of the Depression, some of those early growing pains are behind us. Some of the early leaders are behind us. Musgrave is now writing a massive history of the organization starting in the late 20s, early 30s. The Depression happens, and we've hit our real first stumbling block, I think, both as a country and as a fraternity at that point. Chapters are closing. Men do not have the resources to support a national organization, a fraternity, a chapter house, or even make it to college in many situations. So the 30s were a tough time in general. The Grand Prudential Committee is the governing body. There wasn't a Grand Council yet. The governing body was called the Grand Prudential Committee. The Grand Junior President then was a man named Bob Jagoki. Jagoki can't find an executive secretary in the 30s. There just aren't folks who will work, and we don't have any money to pay them. So he hires his sister for a while, and Jagoki's sister from about 32 to 36 runs the national office using her initials as our executive secretary. The search begins again in 36 as we start to head out of the Depression. It's been 7 years now since the stock market crash. And from this sort of sense of chaos and failure, a real moment of trial, comes Ralph Burns, who is an initiate of Ohio Wesleyan University in 1932. Ralph is from the upper part of Ohio around Youngstown and is a gifted young man. Has a background in social work, has always had an interest in helping people. His Wesleyan education serves him well that way. Jagoki is also from Epsilon chapter at Ohio Wesleyan University. They're introduced to each other through a mutual friend, and Jagoki says, "I think I have a job for you." Ralph Burns is installed as executive secretary in 36. He leads us through, with a lot of other national leaders, through this reorganization of the national organization. We get a Grand Council for the first time. We're recognizing alumni as we never have before. America's still in the depths of the war, right? Pearl Harbor happens in the early 40s. And Ralph, just as he's sort of getting his feet underneath him, finds himself in a position of very few chapters remain open, right? Men have gone overseas, they're fighting for their country. It's difficult for him to make ends meet at the national office. So he takes a day job. He works for an insurance company during the day and runs the fraternity from his home on nights and weekends, really as a volunteer. And that continues for the duration of the war. When the war wraps in the mid-40s, Ralph decides, with the permission of the Grand Council, to move the office out of high-rent New York, where it had historically been since the second founding, to his college hometown, back to Delaware, Ohio. So he and his young wife and their young family, Bruce and Jonathan, their sons, move back to Ohio Wesleyan, and Ralph sets up shop there as the executive secretary of the National Fraternity, and stays in that role for a long period of time. One of the things you have to figure out as the executive secretary, as the CEO of the organization, then is how are you going to make it grow? And certainly they brought in about a chapter a year with petitions and expansion activities. Some of those were previous chapters of fraternities, local organizations came forward and asked for charters. One of Ralph's strategies, though, right as he got there, was to begin taking advantage of opportunities to merge and consolidate with other organizations. So the first one happens with Phi Pi Phi in 1939. As we come out of the Depression, they find themselves in a weakened situation. There are about 5 chapters left there, and they decide to merge into Alpha Sigma Phi. The terms of the merger are interesting, and Ralph learns some lessons that are important to him. The first one is that it was important for Phi Pi Phi, and one of the things that made our relationship attractive was that Alpha Sigma Phi was willing to admit alumni members of that organization into our organization as brothers. And the Grand Council at the time said it would be great if they could all be initiated, Ralph. So the initiation of all Phi Pi Phi alumni fell to Mr. Ralph F. Burns, who spent a lot of time traveling and initiating, and decided that probably wasn't the most effective way to do that. So we get to the end of the war in 1945. In 1946, Alpha Kappa Pi, which is a New England-based organization, not incredibly old, 20, 25 years old, finds itself needing a new home. It has 17 chapters. Alpha Sigma Phi, coming out of the war, has about 17 chapters, so there's a fair match in size there. Alpha Sigma Phi is much older, is better organized. Alpha Kappa Pi needs leadership. They do not have alumni willing to step forward and serve in staff roles for them. The national leadership is a little weaker than ours. So they start talking about some sort of merger. And they need to, Ralph wants it to feel different than the Phi Pi Phi merger. So they really take this more in the form of a consolidation. This is going to be a match of equals. We're just going to fold the two organizations together. And this is part of the way Ralph grows the organization. He's able to double it from 17 to 34 chapters almost overnight. The other key component of the Alpha Kappa Pi consolidation is that there's little overlap in chapters. There are only 2 chapters where we have duplicated chapters. One of those is Penn State, where I understand the Alpha Sig showed up on the doorstep of the Penn State house and said, "Welcome, brothers," and moved right in. The other thing that was important for Ralph is that all members of Alpha Kappa Pi were immediately recognized as alumni of Alpha Sigma Phi. He was not going to spend the next decade doing mass initiations. There were just too many of them this time. That was an important learning. It also meant really not just merging, but consolidating meant that we had to put the two organizations together. And the Alpha Kappa Pi men wanted to live on in some form or fashion. We adopted the Alpha Kappa Pi membership badge as our new member pin, our pledge pin, the 7-pointed star with the cross sabers. Men wore that for decades. We adopted their initiation ritual as our pledge ritual at the time. And we wove a lot of their values and traditions into the ritual and governing practices of the organization from there forward. So truly a consolidation. Because Alpha Sigma Phi was older and stronger, it got the name, and it retained most of its ritualistic character. We added, we didn't subtract from the Alpha Sigma Phi experience to do that consolidation. That merger then gets us to the end of the war and what becomes a bit of a golden era for the organization. The men are back. The GI Bill puts tens of thousands of college-age men into campuses, and from 1945 until 55, we're chartering 1 or 2 groups a year. The organization crests above 1,000 members for the first time, undergraduate members for the first time in about 1960, which is an exciting progression for Ralph, right, who inherited something pretty small in the 1930s. The last way we grew under Ralph was Alpha Gamma Upsilon. That was a merger of a small national organization, about 5 chapters. Started in the 60s. Dr. Otto Sonder, a Hartwick alum, was the faculty advisor at Lycoming College to the Alpha Gamma Upsilon chapter there. And they decided, that Lycoming College chapter, that it was time to leave Alpha Gamma Upsilon. Their organization had become rather small, and they wanted something stronger and better organized. And Otto, really with just the power of his relationship, brought the Lycoming chapter to Alpha Sigma Phi, to Ralph, and once you were in Ralph's grip, he was not going to let you go. So Lycoming decided to petition and accept a charter. 4 of the other chapters of that fraternity, Alpha Gamma Upsilon, accepted charters as well. 1 did not. But effectively, we merged their 5 chapters into Alpha Sigma Phi. And those 3, so Phi Pi Phi, the merger in 39, the consolidation with Alpha Kappa Pi in 46, and the Alpha Gamma Upsilon merger in the 60s, really formed a lot of the expansion strategy for the organization through the 20th century.
Ralph retired in 1976, and the operation of the fraternity as an operational unit was not what it needed to be. The Grand Council turned over, a lot of younger people came in, George Trubo, Richard Gibbs, myself, Stan Miller were some of the key players in that period, and I was in on the ground floor of, after Ralph, it became George Lord, Grand Senior President, then me, taking over an operation that was really a question financially, and I was scared to death. We looked for other revenue sources. which they were practically non-existent. We knew we had to grow, so we got together with the Grand Council. We laid out a plan with the Grand Council. In effect, we bet the farm. We took what little resources we had, and we said, we're going to spend it on making operational improvements, things we can write about in the Tomahawk, and then we're going to raise some funds. And we're not going to do it haphazardly. We're going to bring a professional fundraiser in, which was new at the time for most fraternities, and we need another source of revenues, and that has to come from our alumni. And it has to rely on the goodwill of Ralph Burns and the connections he had. So we set off on this venture. Jeff Hoffman was a part of that when he was an undergraduate. Varner became very involved. And we gained some successes. The Tomahawk came back. We had the old Gal Gazette, which was a newspaper. We added some chapters, which we'd never done before. It's a growth thing. We'd acquired AGU in the late 60s as a merger, but that's the only way we had any growth. And so we were learning as we went. We made a lot of mistakes, but there was a lot of enthusiasm too. I pretty much put in the structure that we pretty much currently use today. So the relationship between the Grand Council and the operating staff is pretty much the same as we did today. The role of fundraising is pretty much the way we set that up. Emphasis on growth and on revenues was a new thing that I pretty much put in. The guy who really made it all happen, I put it in, but the guy who made it happen was Richard Gibbs. And he's a small businessman who knows how to make things happen, or did. I mean, Richard Gibbs has since passed away, but he was excellent at execution. And then Stan Miller, who could sell ice to an Eskimo, became the chief guy that headed up the fundraising campaign. Then Rob Sheehan came in, who was recruited by Kevin. They came from Alpha Nu, the same chapter. Alpha Sig somehow finds leadership at the national level at the darkest times. And, it happened way back in our early times. It happened at Delta chapter when it was the only one there. It happened in 1907 and 8 with Musgrave and that set of characters from Yale. It took us nationally. We paid a lot of attention to it and exhibited extraordinary leadership. And then it happened again with the people I just got through mentioning. And we're very fortunate that when the chips are down, that's why we're here for 100. There are very few organizations that last 175 years, and we're one of them. And it saved Alpha Sig. Without the people I mentioned and the reports we took, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation as Alpha Sig. So it was a critical time. Knowing that if we didn't drastically, and I mean from a breakthrough point of view, break away from the past and the way the fraternity operated, and come up with a strategy that we thought would work, and then and we didn't have resources like you guys got. You know what? We had $20,000. That was it. And how now 20,000 is more like 60,000 today, but still, you guys blow 60,000 in 3 or 4 months. That was forever for us. and so we took that and we updated the Tomahawk. We added a couple of chapters. We started the third founding campaign. And it was gone. and if all of that didn't bring in more initiates, or funds, that would have been the end. In fact, George Lord, even before me, George Lord is no longer with us, but he looked for a couple mergers even before I became Grand Senior President. And And I'd probably, you know, I would be the GOAT, not the greatest of all time either. I would have been the one who let Alpha Sig fail. And don't you know, Kevin and I felt that. I mean, I was scared to death, you know, because I didn't know if it would work. I was committed to making it work, but you never know. And it did. It did. And then the 80s happened, and you know, and then the growth started. And I look at the 80s and 90s. I mean, without that platform, the 80s and 90s would never have happened. So that was betting the farm. Not only did leadership show up, because the fraternity has taken on so many different structures, but the one thing that hasn't changed is the ritual. And that's what's really, that whole experience is what I think motivated all these people I mentioned earlier about who stepped up at what time. They all had this mystic ritual experience that talked about the Alpha, the Sigma, and the Phi. And it made a huge, deep impression on them. Something beyond their own well-being that caused people to see the value of pursuing the Alpha, the Sigma, and the Phi. And that hasn't varied for 175 years. And I think that's extraordinary because, you know, we're saying, you know, like take the United States for example, we're seeing a lot of different values today being considered. That didn't happen with Alpha Sigma Phi. Those are still fundamental, and they are still motivating, and they touch upon a very human high part of who we are. And I think those leaders knew that and internalized it to the point of selfless dedication. And I think that probably still goes on today.
One thing I'll tell you about the 1980s is our fraternity really experienced a transformation during that time. It was a transformation that was informed by big changes that went on in the 60s and 70s, and really things started there. But two big things that really happened in the 80s, if I had to really encapsulate it. The fraternity began to broaden the quality and quantity of the educational programs that we provided to undergraduate brothers. And we've seen that extend dramatically since that time. And secondly, and real importantly, is the fraternity changed its business model, its financial model, from one relying exclusively on undergraduate fees to one that invited alumni to participate in the broadening of educational programs with their financial support. And again, we have seen that increase dramatically since that time, but those two transformations really took place beginning in the 1980s, seeds that were sown in the 70s, and it all took a lot of serious growing pains, but those are two important things to think about when you think about the 1980s. You can't really understand the 80s without understanding the 70s, and you can't understand the 70s without understanding the 60s, but don't worry, I'm not going to go back further than that. Here's an important thing to think about as you think about what happened in the 1980s. From 1965 to 1975, all right, the number of brothers initiated into our fraternity went from 1,100 to just more than 500. So in 10 years, from 65 to 75, the number of brothers, undergraduate brothers, dropped in half. And that was because of all the turmoil that was going on in college campuses. So by 1975, we had lost the number of chapters. And in the mid-1970s, the fraternity began to start chapters back up again and began to try to grow. So in the 1980s, we had a lot of leftover work left from that time of having lost all those chapters. We still had a lot of weak chapters. So during the 80s, I would say that one thing happened is chapters definitely closed, but we reopened a number of them and made them stronger. And then we started really broadening our expansion efforts during the 1980s, which helped us replace some other weaker chapters that were falling off by the wayside. So through the 80s, with those closures and openings, we kind of had been losing out chapters in the 70s and kind of held our own in the 80s, which set us up for nice growth in the 90s and further beyond that. You know, I would just say finances were real tough. And the fraternity was working hard to balance our budget while also providing the highest quality services and educational programs we could possibly provide. And that's where this whole idea of alumni fundraising really, again, kicked into very high gear in the 1980s. And we had done just very little bit of it before that. So what we were doing is we went out to alumni and said, look, you know, we want to provide more educational programs to our undergraduate brothers. And if you can provide some financial support, we can do that. So slowly throughout the 80s, we were able to expand that kind of programming at our national meetings, sometimes at some of the regional meetings, and then certainly through the guys, the chapter leadership consultants that traveled around. So the finances had to be taken care of before we could expand the leadership programs, and those things happened hand in hand over time during the 1980s. Prior to the 80s, when we really got into fundraising in a big way, alumni didn't think of the fraternity as having educational programs that would need that kind of funding. And so it took a big communication challenge in explaining this to people. But now I would say that most alumni, whether they give or not, they know that the fraternity raises money. They know we provide a lot of educational programs. And so I think over the, I can't believe it's been 40 years, we've been successful in getting the word out that this is something that the fraternity does. What has happened, ever since, there's just been a growth on that, and I just think it's very exciting what's happening now. But we were able to expand a lot of those in the 80s, and they've gone crazy good since that time.
So in the history of Alpha Sigma Phi Foundation, there has been transformational gifts that have been realized, and those gifts have come from people's estates, legacy gifts, plan gifts. Three major gifts: the Howard Kleinoeder gift of over $6 million in the early 90s.
One day, we had a phone-a-thon to an alum, and this alum agreed to give $1,000 to the annual giving fund for the fraternity, for the foundation that year. That was a big gift in 1985. And this same brother, Howard Kleinoeder, told the person who called him, I've been thinking about, leaving the fraternity's foundation by will. I see that you all are interested in that now. Why don't you have somebody contact me? And so I called him up, and I went to visit him. The first visit was in his home in Ocala, Florida. He lived on a thoroughbred horse ranch, which is pretty cool. And we just got to know each other. And he asked me about the fraternity's future, and I told him about our dreams of all these educational programs that we had. That, we had dreams of like $15 million worth of educational programs that we would love to start. And, we had just barely raised $1 million, but we had big dreams. I met with him on a number of other occasions throughout the years. And he finally told me that he did leave the foundation in his will, but he would never tell me how much money. In my wildest dreams, I hoped it might be $100,000, because that was the big gifts we were asking for back at that time. And this guy died with an estate of over $20 million. He gave it all to charity, and we got a big chunk of that, $6.4 million. And when I got the phone call that that's how much money we were receiving, I just was blown away. And that was the beginning of helping us, take another step in transformation for our great fraternity.
The 90s really got going in 1989, because in 1989, Howard Kleinoeder passed away and left the fraternity the largest unrestricted gift ever left to a fraternity foundation in the history of the fraternity world. And that was, if you can just imagine something unimaginable happening to the organization at a time when it probably needed it most, that was it. Like, that was one of those moments where you think about where you were when you heard that news. And I actually happened to be with past Grand Senior President Robert Sandercox. Bob Sandercox lived in West Virginia, Bethany College. He was still there at the time. And he shared with me the news of what had happened. And there were still very, very loose details about really what the gift was, how much it would be. But again, unimaginable as far as what that could look like and what that could do for our organization.
What the 80s did was set us up to continue this whole process of raising more money and creating more educational programs. And I think that momentum, even without that Kleinoeder gift, would absolutely have continued. And we know that many other loyal brothers since that time have given wonderful gifts to support our progress since that time. So I think it was certainly set us up in a wonderful way.
We then, under the guidance of Grand Senior President Chuck Vose, brought together a large amount of leadership of the organization from around the country to brainstorm, discuss, identify needs, opportunities, what we could do with that kind of gift, how we could reshape the organization. And it was both inspiring and frustrating, because there were so many needs and it so outpaced what the gift might do for the organization. But it was, again, such an inspiring time within the organization.
And the Gerlach gift was $1 million gift also in that late 90s. The most impactful one for me was the gift that Stan and Dottie Thurston gave to the fraternity. Stan is from Iowa State and was Grand Senior President before me, and I served with him on the Grand Council. I served with him on the foundation board. Dottie was always at Grand Chapter with us as a family. Their girls were at the Grand Chapter. Stan was an amazing leader, and his love for this fraternity, though he was a very quiet, laid-back person, a tremendous leader, and his gift not just transformed the fraternity, because he made the gift when he was living. Dottie and Stan made that gift while they're still living to be able to inspire others to give to this fraternity. And I'm so pleased that we have been able to establish the Stan Thurston Award that goes for ultimate service to an alum for their service to Alpha Sigma Phi, because Stan really was an integral part of giving while he's still living. And I think that's important because it inspires other people to give. Mr. Alpha Sig, Ralph Burns, over 40 years as Executive Secretary of the fraternity. He, to many people, many alums, he is Alpha Sigma Phi. To me, he is Alpha Sigma Phi. When I took over as Executive Director of the fraternity, Ralph was there to help me as a mentor. Throughout my life, my boys were able to meet Ralph Burns and to spend time with Ralph. Ralph kept this fraternity going during lean times, and if it wasn't for his love of this fraternity during those lean times, I would not be sitting here today. The most powerful thing that's ever happened to me in my life was a meeting in November 1993, where both boards were meeting together, the Foundation Board and the Grand Council of Alpha Sigma Phi in Pittsburgh. We decided to talk about the fraternity and what it meant to each of us, the Foundation Board and the Grand Council members. So we went youngest to oldest, talking about what this fraternity, Alpha Sigma Phi, meant to us.
We spoke in order of youngest to oldest, so I was youngest at the time, and went first, and Ralph was oldest and went last. And as, you know, I don't remember his exact words, but he gave such a heartfelt, touching speech about the fraternity, as he always did. I mean, that was just one gracious aspect about Ralph, is that he was always very well-spoken, eloquent, you know, never said too much, but, you know, always said the right thing.
Of course, Ralph was last. And Ralph, in his great way, spoke so eloquently about Alpha Sigma Phi. He talked about how he was a millionaire, not monetary, but because of all the brothers that it impacted his life. He talked to each one of us about a story or a value that we carried that he appreciated. He talked about past Grand Senior presidents and how they had affected his life. He talked about his two sons, Jonathan and Bruce, who were initiated into Alpha Sigma Phi, and how much that meant to him. He talked about Joanna, his wife, and how she had given Ralph up to the fraternity, and how over their marriage she supported him. He talked about Joanna, and he had just sat down and wrote their obituaries and what they wanted people to know about them. He told us, he said, now at my memorial service, I do not want anybody crying, so if you think you're going to cry, don't come to my memorial service. He talked about how great the fraternity was and the good hands that the fraternity was in. He then said to us, the fraternity is in great hands, and I'm so appreciative of your leadership.
We were just playing a couple videos from the two prior leadership conferences just to kind of level set the group in terms of why we're there, you know, what we impact, who we impact, what opportunity we have. And those videos are very undergraduate focused and very focused on our biggest program of the summer. And so it really just, it's a very touching video to watch.
We turned off the lights to watch a video, and Ralph died of a massive heart attack at the table. It was like Ralph was passing this fraternity on to us, giving this to us for the lifetime. I believe he knew he was going to enter the Omega chapter. I believe he knew at that time that he was at peace with his life and with what he has done for Alpha Sigma Phi.
We were a small little fraternity, really, that was respected because of Ralph Burns, but we were a reflection of Ralph Burns' personality, not his operational running of the fraternity, but who he was. And we all so admired that, and were so there isn't one person who wasn't very involved with the fraternity when Ralph was alive that wouldn't say the same thing about Ralph as I'm saying. He's one in a million, and we all know it. And all of our lives were changed because of what Ralph did for us.
Ralph embodied brotherhood. He was one who wanted to share brotherhood, be a good brother, but share brotherhood with others. He was one of these people that at every meeting would walk up to a perfect stranger who was a brother, someone he had never met, many times some of the youngest people at the meeting, and introduce himself and just want to hear their story. And people would be starstruck with Ralph because he was Mr. Alpha Sigma Phi. And he, you know, he made no fuss about who he was. It was all about who he was talking to. And he was just awesome at that. You know, he was a great role model in that regard.
So I'm very, when I think of Alpha Sig, I think of Ralph. Because it was Ralph. If it hadn't been for Ralph, we wouldn't be Alpha Sigma Phi.
He was the face of Alpha Sigma Phi. He was the person that those alumni from the 50s and the 60s in particular knew that guy and trusted that guy. And if they were going to get involved, if they were going to volunteer, if they were going to support with a gift or support a campaign, they were doing it because of Ralph, really. I mean, he was Alpha Sigma Phi to most everyone else. Because back then, when he was executive secretary, the fraternity really didn't have the resources that we do today. And we don't have, it was harder to have the impact that we do today on as many undergraduates that we do today. But he was so willing to share his brotherhood, and I think that's what I remember most and best about Ralph, is that, you know, he was just one of us, but at the same time, he was Mr. Alpha Sigma Phi.
I have to go back actually to Brother John Gibson's tenure as Grand Senior President to lay the foundation for that. the Grand Council, prior to John's efforts to move us towards policy governance, was basically micromanaging the executive. And that was not a healthy environment. And so John had the courage to drive us towards policy governance, where Grand Council was required to focus on strategic objectives, what we called end statements, and allow the CEO then to manage the organization towards those ends. And so he was successful. But if you're going to govern by policy, you have to have a strategic plan. You have to have some kind of a document to articulate where it is you want your CEO to bring the organization. And so that was really the genesis for the need and the desire to build that first 2005 strategic plan. It was not an easy journey. The council had academically embraced the concept of policy governance, but we had no muscle memory. We hadn't ever exercised it. And so the journey to get from a blank piece of paper to the 30-some page document that made up that first strategic plan took quite some time. But I think in the end, we were all very proud of what we developed, because it did, in fact, lay out for the first time an articulated vision, an articulated purpose, and a very clearly defined roadmap to move us towards that vision and fulfill our purpose. Having the strategic plan developed was the first success that I would mention, because it, for the first time, gave us a cohesive roadmap to a defined future that we really were trying to achieve. And that allowed all of the resources of our organization and all the energy of the brothers, staff, council, etc., to be focused together, to move forward together towards those objectives. You know, and I remember Brother Bob Coots telling me right after we approved the strategic plan that said, "Mark, what, you know, great effort, but you're never going to get it done." And I thought about that for a moment, and I said, "Bob, you know, you're probably right, but even if we don't get it all done, we will move forward, and we will move forward together." And he has since, you know, later on, he came back to me and acknowledged that that was in fact what had happened. And you know, here we are, you know, now talking about a 2025 plan. So 20 years later, we are still governing our organization on strategic plans. And a little bit of my ego showing, I'm always a little pleased to see that some of the language from the first strategic plan still finds its way into some of our documents and our website and things like that. So the string that, you know, began back then in 2005 is continuing on. You know, our size was a huge challenge. We had struggled to grow for decades. I mean, I've been actively involved on the national level for probably 30 years, maybe more now. And we had never, you know, gotten really above that upper 50s mark and sustained it for more than a year or so. And that was putting a huge strain on our financial capabilities. And so growth was necessary. And so growth was part of the strategic plan. Member recruitment was the number 3 objective. And through that objective, we began the process of laying out mechanisms to accelerate our ability to grow. Of course, it wasn't until Gordy Hemmerger came on board as our CEO that really took off. And I'm so very proud of what he has accomplished, along with all of the staff members that have been involved in running our fraternity over these last 10 years, to have gone from, I think it was 58 chapters when I gave up Grand Senior President to now 179 units. It's incredible. For, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, I was a co-lead facilitator for the Burns Institute. And one year, I forget which camp we were at. This was back in the days when it was at a camp, and so it was more of an outdoors-oriented activity. And Drew Thawley was the CEO, and we were there together. And we were just talking as we were setting up the cabins for the participants that would be coming in the next day. And we've been talking about values and the fact that they're too hidden and too not a part of our lives as a brotherhood for quite a while. And so Drew and I looked at each other and we said, you know what? Let's name the cabins after our values. Let's just do it. And of course, Drew was appalled. He said, Mark, that's part of the ritual. It's secret. We can't do that. And I looked at him and I said, well, I'm the Grand Senior President. We're going to do it. I'll take responsibility. And so we did. And it was interesting to watch the undergraduates' reactions as they were assigned their cabins. Because a few of them, surprisingly, remarkably, recognized the words silence, charity, purity, honor, and patriotism, which was, as I said, a surprise. And then they started to talk. First to us, going, you know, we can't do this. It's okay. It'll be all right. Out of context, they're just words. Don't worry about it. And then they started talking to each other. And I knew at that moment that making the values public was the key thing that we had to do to ensure that we were living up to the pledges that we made during our ritual initiation. You know, we join because of the sense of brotherhood that we feel. We may not call it that at the time, but that's why we join. But the organization has an identity too, and our values are part of what describes the identity of our organization. You know, you bring up a really great point about recruitment. During the early to mid 2000s, college campuses were changing rapidly, and the Greek system was under stress. The millennial generation was coming to campus. They were generally non-Greek because of the stereotypes of hazing and alcohol abuse and poor grades. And college administrations were getting more and more active in trying to manage the risk associated with the Greek system. And of course, we at the time, a very small fraternity, 54, 56 chapters, were under great financial pressure. And our chapters were actually getting smaller. We would charter 4 in a year and we'd lose 4. We'd charter 3 and lose 2. And that had been going on for a long, long time. And we were concerned that the change in demographic, the change in the millennial generation could be the nail in the coffin for us as an organization and perhaps for Greeks, you know, writ large. And so we were motivated to try to make some changes, and recruiting around the concept of values was not something that you would generally find in a Greek system anywhere around the country back in the mid-2000s. And so we were fairly certain that the millennial generation would be open to hearing that type of language and then seeing the brothers really live those values. And so we were fairly confident that that was going to be a good recruitment tool if our chapters would embrace it. And I would like to think that our explosive growth over the last decade has been at least a little bit in part to that change.
It started with kind of the strategic planning process that was started by GSP Still and Ritter. And what that allowed us to do is to really focus on a handful of things. I think, you know, good organizations really have great, talented people, which we certainly do, but what they also have is alignment on a set of goals. And I think we struggled with alignment on goals until we got that strategic plan done. And you know, for us, the 2020 plan that the Grand Council I was fortunate enough to be a part of really kind of crystallized what we cared about, what we thought was important for Alpha Sig and the organization as a whole. And, you know, for us, it was really growth. We realized that we had just a fantastic ritual. We had great values. We had great leadership. And what we really needed was more people, more brothers, more chapters, more alumni. And that's really kind of the key focus that we had coming out of that 2020 strategic plan. We spent some time talking about what that meant to us as far as metrics went. You know, but really what we had was just a talented group of people, and we had people that were aligned to a specific mission. You know, as far as what that has brought us, I mean, you know, fraternity is a brotherhood, but fraternity is a business. And in order for us to invest in the programs that we have now, being able to provide the resources to chapters and to members that we can now, we needed scale. We needed more members. And, you know, what you're seeing now, as I sit here as a has-been, a past GSP, what I see, all of the great things, all of the great leadership and educational programs that brothers are able to participate in now, quite a bit of that is fueled. Was fueled by the growth that we were able to enjoy over a, you know, good solid 7 to 8 year period. For me personally, the 2020 strategic plan was the first thing I did as GSP. So it was like, hey, great, you know, you're elected. Here you go. We got to figure out a strategic plan. And up until that point, I think that strategic plans had been crafted really by a couple of people, as opposed to a broader set of the organization. And when we did the 2020 strategic plan, there was really mostly the Grand Council and some staff members and a couple of key alumni that got together in a conference room. I want to say it was somewhere in Florida, but it's been some time now. And you know, we began a process, and I think we had a good understanding of where we wanted the organization to go. I think that the success that we had seen through prioritization of growth, in particular by Ritter and by Still, and then with the hiring of Gordy, we knew that that's where we wanted to go. I think what was great about the 2020 strategic plan process is that we involved the entire Grand Council, and we really put to paper not only what we believed in, what we aspired to be, but also how we were going to get there. And that detail and those objectives in detailed form really allowed us to keep track of how we were doing. And you know, as you grow in your career and as a person, you realize that if you don't have alignment, you really are going to struggle no matter what you do. And that's really what we had when we did the 2020 strategic plan. You know, we caught a little bit of good luck. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The growth of, you know, undergraduate men on campuses certainly helped. We caught a little bit of luck, a lot of luck in hiring Gordy and having somebody that was, you know, also aligned with what we were thinking as it relates to growth. But I think that was what was great about the 2020 strategic plan. I would get questions all the time, you know, as we kind of managed through this, and you know, people would ask me what I thought of it. The immediate question was always, "You guys sure that you think this is what you want to put out there? This is awfully bold." And my answer to that was always the same: is that we may not hit some of these things. And truth be told, particularly around the growth of chapter numbers and undergraduate men on campus, I thought that the numbers we were talking about were crazy. I remember we would have these hallway conversations during this process, you know, and Gordy would float that. He'd be like, "What do you think about this?" And I'm like, "This guy, I don't know, man." I mean, you know, it wasn't that long ago where we remember 50 chapters, and we achieved quite a bit of it. And I think had we not really put that to paper, had we not acted in a bold manner, I don't think we would have been as successful as we had been over those, you know, 7 years or so, and particularly as it relates to growth. And then the other question that I always get is, what would you do differently? And my answer to that was always the same. I wish we would have involved more people in the discussion as to what this strategic plan needed to be. And I think that's what's most satisfying for me as we come into this new strategic plan period is that the number of people involved, the constituents that were a part of designing this new plan is much broader. And to me, that's encouraging. I think it's one of the lessons that I learned out of the 2020 strategic plan process. And I really am excited for what this is going to do. But, that plan, the process we went through, and then our ability to achieve on those things, it's some of the most rewarding achievements that I've been a part of. We had a series of executives that were pretty bold personalities. I worked for Tom Hinckley. I worked with Drew Tully. You've got all these people that you see still at events, Cheney and Sheehan and Garvey and all these guys. And, none of them is a wallflower. I mean, that each of them is there, right? Some different than others. I mean, certainly some are quieter, but you know that they're there. So making that hire is a tough hire. And as is typical for Alpha Sig, everybody's got an opinion. And everybody is just absolutely steadfast that their opinion's the right one. And, Ritter had to run this process. And the amount of stuff that Rich Ritter dealt with as GSP was pretty incredible. And he just did a tremendous job leading the organization. And one of those things that he had to do was to hire Gordy. And it took some courage, because I'll tell you right now, it was not a slam dunk. I mean, we sit here today in 2020, it's like, geez, why wouldn't we have hired Gordy? I mean, it just made sense, right? I mean, we were able to achieve all of these things that we talked about as it relates to growth, and the fraternity's in such better shape than it was financially. It's more stable. It's at scale. It's got all these great things. And, a lot of that's through Gordy's leadership. That wasn't certain when we went through that process. And, Ritter in particular, Rich is the kind of guy where he when he knows what he wants, he's going to get it. And he's pretty firm in his convictions. And getting to that point, making that decision was a bold move. So, and I think that's a piece of this that a lot of people don't really focus on. I think they see the results of Gordy, but I don't think we should overlook the process and the decision that was made and how we got there. As it relates to Gordy specifically, I've known Gordy for a long time. When I was a chapter leadership consultant working on staff, I visited Bowling Green, and Gordy was there as the president. Gordy's got just an innate ability to achieve. He is incredibly driven. He will get results. And what I always enjoyed about working with Gordy, I mean, he and I worked very closely over those years as I was on the Grand Council and then ultimately as GSP. You could be very upfront with Gordy. You could be direct. And when you set expectations, you knew without a doubt that he was going to achieve those. And that's exactly what we needed at that time. And it's why we've benefited so greatly over these years, is because Gordy is laser focused on achieving objectives. And when we have people, Grand Councils in particular, that participate fully and engage with Gordy to shape those objectives for the best interest of the organization, that's when things are really clicking. And that's what we had. We had a really good set of Grand Councils that were focused on a long-term mission, that did not have agendas, that were truly looking for the best interest of the organization long-term. And we had an executive in Gordy that could absolutely just crush it and achieve pretty much anything you set in front of them. And I really enjoyed that. And I think, it's nice to be part of something like that success. And Gordy's a huge piece of that. There's no doubt about this. And, as you think long term about, how people are remembered and how they're viewed as it relates to the fraternity, certainly there are the Hall of Fame kind of folks, and you've talked to some of them. There are others that, we hear about that, came before us. And I would put Gordy in that conversation without question. For me, alumni involvement is a personal thing, right? So, my chapter, Delta Phi, Grand Valley, we were all founding fathers. We were kids, 18 to 21-year-old kids that kind of had an idea of what we wanted to do that was different than what we saw on campus. But we didn't know what we were doing. And we were fortunate enough to have alumni involvement from other chapters. And in particular, a guy by the name of Bob Look, who was very involved in the Lawrence Tech chapter, all the way over on the other side of the state. And, it was amazing to me as an undergraduate to see a guy who was professional, who had a family, who was willing to devote his time and energy, advice, and counsel to this, group of kids who were trying to start a new chapter. And that left a really big impression on me. It left a really big impression, frankly, on a lot of guys at Delta Phi. And what it made me realize is that specific chapter level involvement of alumni is incredibly important. And I think, what we've learned over time, and in particular over these past few years of growth, is that if you have sustained, effective local alumni engagement, you're going to have healthier chapters. You're going to have chapters that last longer, that do better things, and more importantly, have an impact on brothers in a more positive way. So, to me, it's incredibly important. Obviously, from a foundation standpoint, we need donors. We need people that are willing to invest their treasure in addition to their time to make sure that, we can provide the grants and the opportunity to the fraternities so that the fraternity can continue to do its good work. But I think what we realize, particularly with the 2020 strategic plan, and now as we move into this next strategic plan, is that we have to engage alumni in a more meaningful way, but we also need a broader base of alumni. When I was an undergraduate, or even when I was on staff, it was the same handful of folks. And, one of the benefits of scale and growth is that we have a wider net that we can cast. But I think engaging alumni for chapter's sake and undergraduate brothers' sake is important. I think we've done a good job at that. I think we really need to focus as an organization on making sure that alumni engagement continues to be meaningful for the alumnus as they navigate all of the stuff that comes after those 4 years in college. I've been fortunate enough to be a part of the organization as a brother since '96, but affiliated with the organization since '94. So I've been able to see the growth of our programs over time. I remember going to, a president's leadership academy when I was the president of the undergraduate organization, 70 guys, maybe 80. And to, stand on stage or be in a plenary session in those last few grand chapters and to see the sea of faces was just incredible. So the growth has been fantastic. I think, and I've always believed, that when done right, fraternity can be a tremendous complement to the gaps that exist in today's undergraduate experience. And what I mean by that is, everybody goes to college and you learn certain things. You major in something, you have classroom learning, you retain some of that, and some of that's useful. Certainly in certain disciplines, it's more useful than others. I imagine engineering, you use a lot more that you learned in college than, for example, my psychology degree for what you do professionally. But what I don't think anyone can question is that the majority of what you do in your professional life and the way that you achieve at a level in your professional life really is tied back to what I believe are soft skills, leadership skills, education that is outside of the classroom. And I personally believe at my core that fraternity is the best equipped to provide those types of skills to young men. I think sororities as well for women. And I think that one of the things that Alpha Sig's always done well is have programs that are designed to round out our individual brothers, provide them those tools that they are not going to get in the classroom, and set them on a path for success that they otherwise wouldn't have if they weren't a part of Alpha Sig. And what was encouraging to me in this period of growth is that I knew that to be the case, and to see all of the growth in the number of brothers that attended these leadership programs gave me confidence that we were making an impact, not only on our organization and those individual brothers, but also all of the ripple effect of, good people and their families and their communities, their businesses, whatever it may be that they do with their lives, knowing that they had an experience at Alpha Sig and we played a part in that was really cool. And I think that that's the power of programming. I think that's the power of fraternity. I think that's the power of the education done right. And I think that we've done a really good job in achieving that. And I'm pretty excited about a more intentional focus on measuring that and looking at that in the years to come. Yeah, I think, CLVEN really started organically. It wasn't something that was, Grand Council really, or certainly a GSP-led initiative. I think what we realized as an organization is a couple of things. One, I think we realized the power, both positive and negative, frankly, that shared living environments can have for fraternities. And I think CLVEN was the beginning of a more intentional focus on making sure that those experiences were positive. I think first and foremost, that's really kind of what was at least top of my mind. Secondly, is I think we had historically, as an organization, relied heavily on local housing organizations to kind of manage things. And some did a really good job with that. Some did not, some struggled. And I think what we realized, and this was really in the beginning stages of the conversation around CLVEN, was that we could provide a best practices type of a resource. And that's really kind of how it started was, we don't think we're ready to start owning properties, managing properties, whatever it may be, but we think we can provide tools and resources to these local alumni volunteers out there that are trying to run housing corporations. And that's really how it started. Always with that secondary goal, though, of making an intentional attempt at creating positive living environments. So that's how it started. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure where it was going to go. The initial funding of CLVEN certainly had a little bit of controversy involved with it. I think it was a little bit of a leap of faith for a lot of people because you were asking chapters, you were asking people to commit dollars to something that really didn't have a whole lot of structure around it. But we did it, and I think where it's at now is pretty incredible. Like a lot of other things, when you have new initiatives, you have fits and starts. There were certainly stalls here and there, but the work that's been done from volunteers as well as staff members to make CLVEN what it is today is commendable, and I think it is aligned with our initial thoughts around best practices, but also that more aspirational goal of really creating positive shared living environments for many of our undergraduate brothers.
Our current capital campaign is probably the most aggressive capital campaign that we've ever had as a fraternity. And it's right now on track to certainly be the most successful campaign that we've had. It was started to really meet a lot of different needs. And our educational programming for our undergraduates particularly are very expensive, and as we grow and we want more men to participate in those programs, well, the expense just continues to climb, and so we need funding sources to be able to keep that going. The capital campaign not only supports those broad educational programs, but it also supports individual chapters through chapter endowments. And that enables the chapter to do some pretty special things like award their own scholarships, send men to these leadership conferences and to our grand chapters, and just plays a really significant role in the life of the fraternity.
It kind of set us apart with the leadership programs that we were able to offer. It provided scholarships to undergraduates who maybe wouldn't have been able to stay in school. They would have to leave because of their financial situations. It provided the unbelievable leadership programming that enabled the undergraduates to be able to learn more about Alpha Sigma Phi, and not just Alpha Sigma Phi, but the leadership of Alpha Sigma Phi.
It's really true that we can't operate without the generous donations of our contributors. And we're very fortunate to have not only brothers who contribute, but friends of the fraternity who contribute to our capital campaign, and that's very significant.
It's important for us to provide financial aid to students so that they can stay in college or university, stay with their studies. So it's important for our foundation to realize that we provide thousands and thousands of dollars every year in scholarship aid to those undergraduates. And it's aid to recognize great scholarship, but it's also aid just to help them get through their education. So I think what's important is that people understand that this fraternity is not just having an impact on the educational programs of the national organization, but it's having an impact on each and every undergraduate that receives a scholarship.
It's really about putting your money into the belief of the fraternity, into really supporting our mission and supporting our values as we're reaching out to young men and through our programs and through the association of Brotherhood, be able to create better men, and which in turn, of course, we believe creates a better society.
And it's not just raising money. I want to make this clear. What the foundation does is it gives people the opportunity to invest in something very important, and that's the Brotherhood of Alpha Sigma Phi.
We've connected with a lot of members who haven't heard from us in a long time, and by doing that, we're building that connection once again, that synergy of Brotherhood with those men, and many of them are beginning to volunteer and taking a role in our chapters and facilitating in our national gatherings, and that's to me as important as getting the dollars in the doors to be able to do those things. We're on track to be successful, and that by July of 2020 we should be really close, if not exceeding that mark of $10 million. And I think that that's going to give us all a great opportunity to celebrate, and I hope take a deep breath and start the next campaign. In 2020, we are completing our 2020 plan, which saw tremendous growth. We were able to expand on a number of campuses throughout the United States and Canada, and really grow this fraternity and grow our Brotherhood. That's been significant. But we started looking at what's our next act? What do we do next? And so in developing the 2025 plan, we've been looking at particularly the changes of the environment on college campuses. And there are a lot of challenges. There are a number of challenges that we have to be realistic about. One being that fewer men are choosing to attend higher education institutions. And so that limits our pool of potential members. And of the men who do come to college, many of them are choosing not to participate in fraternity life. And in fact, most colleges and universities have a multitude of opportunities for campus involvement that didn't exist 30 years ago or 50 years ago. But we know that Alpha Sigma Phi has a deeper role to play than those particular kinds of clubs, as valuable as they can be. But we believe that ours is much richer, a much richer experience. So in developing the 2025 plan, we started looking at how do we maintain some relevance? How are young men are different today than they were 30 years ago. So how does Alpha Sigma Phi impact their lives? How can we make sure that they have an enriching experience as undergraduates? We also wanted to look at how do we maintain that relevancy in the future. We have to be nimble. The world is changing around us rapidly, And if we are not nimble enough to take advantage of those changes, then we're going to get behind. And one of the things that I think that Alpha Sigma Phi is dedicated to now is to stay ahead of the curve as much as possible. And so I think that that led us to looking at 3 basic priorities for our 2025 plan. One is growth. And growth is incredibly important to any organization, but definitely to college fraternities. And we are looking at how do we continue our growth. In our completion of our 2020 plan is, you know, we did have that tremendous growth period, but we're seeing that that's beginning to taper off because of the changes in environment on college campuses. And because of those changes, we're having to be realistic, but look at you know, where those opportunities still exist and making sure that we pursue open and quality chapters. At the same time, though, we have to be very careful to take our existing chapters, those legacy chapters that have been around for decades and some 100 years, and make sure that they are getting the support and resources they need to grow organically to help keep them relevant on their campuses and to share that experience of brotherhood with men on those campuses. So whether it's the chapter's been around for just a couple of years or again it's been around for 100 years, we are focusing on how do we help our existing chapters grow and do better for themselves. Another area of focus for the 2025 plan is undergraduate achievement. And that's a broad category too, but we wanted to make sure that we looked at all aspects of what undergraduate life is. And we're wanting to provide, again, that richer experience of brotherhood and relevance of organization to a young man so that they will want to participate in Alpha Sigma Phi for a longer period of time. And we also want to make sure that our undergraduates are achieving academically. That's a very important part of our mission. Fraternity should be an enhancing part of the educational experience, not a detrimental part of the educational experience. And so I want to be able to look at a parent, you know, a mother or a father in the eye and say that if your son joins Alpha Sigma Phi, they have a better chance of making better grades than they do on their own. That we're going to have an environment that is supportive of academics and encourage them to do the best that they can. Part of that is through scholarships, you know, being able to offer more scholarships than we have in the past, and really do more programming to encourage that academic achievement. The last leg of our 3-legged stool of priorities for the 2025 plan is lifetime engagement of our members. This, I think, is imperative. We are graduating more alumni every year now as an organization than we ever have in the past. And that gives us an opportunity to take advantage of the love and dedication that those men have for Alpha Sigma Phi and make sure that we are relevant in their lives in the future. This not only helps us, you know, of course, with volunteers and with people coming in and helping with programs, working with our chapters and undergraduates, but also their own ability to network with each other and network with older alumni. I think that we're trying to look at Alpha Sigma Phi, as we've always said, Alpha Sigma Phi is brotherhood for life. And if we're not encouraging that, if we're not giving our alumni the opportunities to participate throughout life, then I think we've failed. So this gives us that opportunity to really look at it and see how can we enhance the alumni experience. So those are the 3 priorities. Growth, we're going to continue to grow both with some new chapters, not at the pace that we've been, but certainly we're going to continue to grow with new chapters. We're going to look at our organic growth and make sure that we're supporting our existing chapters with the resources and the knowledge and the tools that they need to improve their ability to grow on their campuses. We're looking for an enhanced undergraduate experience and helping undergraduates achieve more and to have a deeper, richer experience in Alpha Sigma Phi. and make sure that they are being set on the right path for life, a very values-based life. And thirdly, we are looking at how do we keep our alumni engaged throughout their lives. Alpha Sigma Phi was founded to meet a specific need, and that need brought young men together. And that has not changed. That has not changed, that need to bring young men together. So one of the real values, I think, of Alpha Sigma Phi is this creation of brotherhood and the perpetuation of brotherhood, this one-to-one experience that we have with each other, which I think is really at the central part at the heart of Alpha Sigma Phi.
Alpha Sigma Phi has been relevant in its history by the brotherhood that it exhibits to its brothers. I've been involved with this fraternity for a long time and have had tremendous relationships and brotherhoods with all generations of Alpha Sigs. So it doesn't matter if you're old like me or a younger brother just as an undergraduate. Alpha Sigma Phi is the bond that loops us all together. And the relevancy is that we all care for each other, that we are all there for each other, that we provide educational programming for each other, that we come back to the chapter and we help the undergraduates with retreats or whatever they need. Our financial contributions help this fraternity to have an impact on people's lives.
We were able to take that brotherhood and share it with others in those early years. It was struggling to be able to do so. And during our first 100 years, if you will, there were many challenges of being able to share that brotherhood. But each time Alpha Sigma Phi hit a stumbling block, we were able to recreate ourselves. We were able to enhance our mission and see that phoenix rise again and be able to attract more young men to the fraternity and to make it a great place for men to gather, to share their own experiences, life together as undergraduates, and to develop those lifelong friendships that really do mean so much. Probably more today to men than it has in the past. And I think that Alpha Sigma Phi has that certain magic, if you will. There's something really intangible that's difficult to put a finger on, but it's there. It's a living, breathing thing that continues to evolve as the fraternity evolves. That's how we stay relevant. We stay relevant by reaching out to see what the needs of young men are and create ways to touch those needs and help those needs and enhance the lives of those young men. And by doing so, then I think we create older men who are better citizens. They're better husbands, they're better fathers, they're better brothers. And by doing that, I think we're able to better the society that we live in. And that is a part of Alpha Sigma Phi that doesn't change. That is part of our total reason for being.
What do I think of when I think of Alpha Sigma Phi? A couple things come to mind on different levels. I think of the Cardinal and Stone Banquet. That is, for me, now, especially now more than ever, when you have 1,000 Alpha Sigs in the room singing for He's an Alpha Sig and cheering for our latest award winners or our Hard Year Award winner or our Alumni Award winners, that even today, right now, gives me goosebumps because it is such a great feeling about everything that is right with Alpha Sigma Phi and with fraternities today.
For me, it's as you go through your evolution as a member of the organization, different things matter at different times. And for me, when I became brother of Alpha Sig, it was an important part of my life. You know, I needed Alpha Sig, just very frankly, and I needed my brothers that I had at Grand Valley. And you know, as things change and your life changes, you get different stuff out of the organization, and it's just as meaningful though. And I think that's what's cool about fraternity, and I think that's what's cool about what we have with Alpha Sig, is that although it changes and although it evolves, the deepness, the richness of the meaning of what you go through as a 18, 19-year-old kid doesn't really change. And you can't say that about a lot of things. And I just couldn't be more appreciative, honored to be a part of this organization. And I'm pretty fired up about where we're at. You know, obviously it's kind of a disappointment we weren't able to get together in such a monumental year, but you know, in my 20-something years of being a part of this organization, I've never been more excited about what we've been able to accomplish, but more importantly, where we're going. I really believe we're on the right track.
Anytime I think about Alpha Sigma Phi, I can't help but think about Ralph. And the one thing he talked about so often was the importance of brotherhood. And I think that is a foundational thing for us to remember as we commemorate 175 years and we look toward 200 years and more, is that those friendships and relationships that we develop in college as well as oftentimes after college through the fraternity, and how important that is. Because life will throw us all kinds of challenges and problems. And when that happens, we need to rely on each other. We need to lean on each other. What do we have left at the end of the day anyway than the relationships we have, the friendships we have, and the brotherhood we have? And so the importance of brotherhood is the one takeaway.
The other things, though, that I think about are some of the brothers that I talk to on a fairly regular basis who may or may not have even been brothers in my own chapter. I feel that I had a phenomenal chapter experience as an undergraduate, and that's why I'm involved with Alpha Sigma Phi today. You know, we had an undergraduate experience that was positive, supportive, wasn't perfect, but at, you know, the ages of 19, 20, 21 was the best possible experience that I could have hoped for, from developing friends, developing brotherhood, getting through school, getting through, you know, issues that happen in your developing adult life that really impact you.
I used to do at Burns a little I don't know, dramatization, I guess, if you will, of December 6th, 1845. You know, in a small boarding house room in at Yale College, and Louis Manigault and Stephen Hornby Ray and Horace Spangler Weiser were sitting around deciding as 18-year-olds that they were going to start a new fraternity. A fraternity that was different than all the others that existed at Yale at the time. One that wasn't built on hazing or exclusiveness or any of the other negatives that the sophomore, junior, and senior societies at Yale had at the time. But something that was inclusive, that was embracing, that was based on brotherhood. And I think about being, you know, Louis Manigault was hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home, 18 years old, and he had the vision, he had the dream of Alpha Sigma Phi. He had the courage to set it up and to fight for it, and obviously he had the character that others were willing to follow. So here we are 175 years later. His vision is still alive. His concept of brotherhood thrives in Alpha Sigma Phi, and I couldn't be prouder to be a part of the organization.
Happy 175th anniversary to Alpha Sigma Phi. The impact that this organization has had on my life, my son's lives, and thousands of other people is just amazing. And I just want to say happy 175th.
Happy 175th anniversary to Alpha Sigma Phi.
Happy 175 Alpha Sigma Phi.